two groups of women, same age range, same 6-month program, same 500-calorie daily deficit. Both groups lost almost exactly the same amount of weight, about 15 pounds each on average. Only one group's brain test scores actually improved. The difference between them wasn't diet content, exercise, or willpower. It was a single variable, a few hours a day. And this isn't some old wellness myth. This data was presented just days ago at one of the largest nutrition science conferences in the country. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what changed between these two groups, why researchers think it mattered independently of weight loss itself, and what a careful, honest read of this brand new research actually supports, not the exaggerated version you'll see everywhere else this week. This comes from a team at Rutgers University, led by Dr. Sue Shapses, presented at Nutrition 2026, the flagship annual meeting of the American Society for Nutrition, just this past week. Here's exactly what they did. 47 women, ages 50 to 79, all carrying overweight or obesity, enrolled in a 6-month weight loss program. Every single participant was counseled to cut roughly 500 calories a day. That part was identical across the board, no differences in calorie targets. The only thing that differed was timing. One group was asked to compress all their eating into a window of less than 9 hours a day. In practice, most of them ate roughly between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., averaging about 8.2 hours of eating per day. The other group kept a more typical pattern, eating across roughly 12.3 hours a day on average. Think breakfast fairly early, dinner, and maybe a snack fairly late. 6 months later, both groups had lost weight, almost identically, about 15 pounds each, on average. If the story ended there, this wouldn't be a very interesting video. But it doesn't end there. Here's the part that made researchers sit up. Despite losing essentially the same amount of weight, only the shorter eating window group showed meaningful improvement on certain cognitive tests, which raises an obvious question. If the pounds lost were the same, what exactly was different enough inside their bodies to move the needle on brain function? The specific tests that improved were measures of spatial planning and executive function, essentially the kind of problem-solving and organizational thinking tests that tend to show wear and tear as people age, and that are closely watched by researchers studying dementia risk. The women eating within that 8 to 9 hour window showed significantly better performance on these tests compared to the women eating across the standard 12-hour window. Even though, again, both groups were the same age range, lost comparable weight, and followed the same calorie deficit. Dr. Shapses put it plainly, losing weight alone already helps ward off some age-related cognitive decline. That part isn't new or controversial. What's new here is the suggestion that there may be an additional benefit specifically tied to stopping eating a few hours before bed and narrowing the eating window to 8 to 9 hours, on top of whatever benefit comes from the weight loss itself. In plain terms, weight loss seems to help your brain. This study suggests when you eat, independent of how much weight you lose, might be doing some of its own separate work. So if the calories were equal and the weight loss was equal, what's actually happening biologically during those extra compressed hours that could explain a brain-level difference? That's where this gets genuinely interesting, and it comes down to a system your body runs on a strict schedule, whether you respect that schedule or not. Your body runs on a circadian rhythm, an internal, roughly 24-hour clock that doesn't just control when you feel sleepy, but also governs digestion, hormone release, inflammation levels, and metabolic activity throughout the day. Eating late into the evening, close to bedtime, means you're asking your digestive system to run an active shift during hours your body is biologically trying to wind down and shift into repair mode. Researchers studying this area suggest that aligning your eating pattern more closely with your natural circadian rhythm may reduce chronic low-grade inflammation, the kind of slow background inflammation that's increasingly linked to age-related cognitive decline over the long term, separate from weight itself. Here's an analogy that might make this click. Imagine your body has a night shift crew whose entire job is cleanup and repair, clearing out cellular waste, running maintenance, doing the kind of housekeeping that keeps organs, including your brain, functioning well over decades. If you keep sending in new deliveries, food coming in late at night, then that night shift crew has to keep stopping cleanup to handle new arrivals instead. Compress your eating into an earlier window, and you're giving that crew a full, uninterrupted shift to actually finish the job. That's a plausible, biologically reasonable mechanism. But plausible isn't the same thing as proven, and there's an honest conversation worth having here about exactly how much weight this one study should carry before you go rearranging your entire eating schedule based on it. I want to slow down here, because this is exactly the kind of finding that tends to get wildly overstated by the time it finishes traveling through social media. First, this was a small pilot study. 47 total participants split across 2 groups isn't a small sample by accident. It's genuinely modest, and results from studies this size can shift substantially once tested in larger populations. Second, this was specifically women, ages 50 to 79, who were already carrying overweight or obesity and already enrolled in a structured weight loss program. That's a fairly specific population. Whether the same effect shows up in men, in younger adults, or in people not actively trying to lose weight is genuinely an open question the study doesn't answer. Third, and this matters for how seriously to weigh this right now, these findings were presented at a conference. That's a legitimate, normal part of how science gets shared early, but it's a different stage than a fully peer-reviewed, published paper that other researchers have had the chance to scrutinize and attempt to replicate. Fourth, the cognitive improvements measured here were specific test scores, spatial planning, executive function, not a formal reduction in diagnosed dementia or Alzheimer's cases. That's an important, honest distinction. Better performance on a cognitive test is a meaningful, measurable signal. It is not the same claim as this prevents dementia, even though the two get blurred together constantly in headlines. None of that means this finding is meaningless. Quite the opposite. It's a genuinely promising early signal from a well-designed randomized trial. But it does mean the responsible move is treating this as a strong hypothesis worth taking seriously, not a settled fact worth overhauling your life around overnight. So what does that actually mean for what you do starting tomorrow morning? If you're over 50, especially if weight loss is already something you're working on, this study offers a genuinely low-risk, low-cost adjustment worth considering. Try compressing your eating into a roughly 8 to 9 hour window, generally stopping food intake about 4 hours before bed, the same pattern this study tested. Practically, that might look like eating between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., or shifting slightly to whatever window fits your actual schedule. The specific clock hours matter less than the total window size and that buffer before sleep. This isn't extreme fasting, and it isn't about eating less overall necessarily. The calorie deficit in this study was identical between both groups. It's specifically about when those calories happen to land during your day. A few sensible guardrails worth mentioning. If you have diabetes, are on medications timed around meals, are pregnant, or have a history of disordered eating, this kind of eating window change is exactly the sort of thing to discuss with a doctor first, rather than adopting on your own based on one pilot study. For most other healthy adults over 50 curious about trying it, the actual risk of experimenting with a slightly earlier, narrower eating window is low. And if this research holds up under further study, you'd potentially be getting ahead of a benefit years before it would otherwise show up as a problem. So here's where this actually leaves us. Losing weight helps protect your brain as you age. That part isn't new. What's new, and worth watching closely as more research comes out, is the idea that when you eat those calories might be doing separate additional work, quietly in the background. Every single night your body gets an uninterrupted shift to do its own maintenance. It's a small study. It's an early signal. But it's also a remarkably easy thing to test on yourself, with essentially nothing to lose except a few extra hours of snacking you probably won't miss anyway. If this gave you a clearer, more honest picture of what this new research actually shows, subscribe. I break down what the science really says. No fluff, no fear-mongering.